This is we the people. Again, this is a learning video. If you guys want to improve on being a jury. I'm a firm believer today the reason why innocent people get convicted is because of the ignorance of the jury. Alrighty? And if we start learning more about it, maybe we can actually start holding government officials accountable. Now, if I'm not mistaken, and I could be mistaken, I think this had to do with, well, no, let's just play it because I cannot remember exactly where this is at, but I've seen this video before. Let's mark that out of the way first before we proceed forward. Alright.
Welcome, everyone. This is Kirsten Tynan, Executive Director of the Fully Informed Jury Association. Happy Jury Rights Day. Today's presentation is entitled Jury Duty is for Heroes. Back in January of 2020, I had the opportunity to give a TEDx talk in little old Hamilton, Montana. But the thing about that is they only let you have 15 minutes. And I didn't get to tell nearly the number of stories that I have of jurors who have heroically stood up for the accused in a case for a number of reasons, many times because the law was wrong, and sometimes because even though the law was generally right, in a particular case at hand, it was wrong. So I'm going to tell some of those stories, and those will be not only historic stories, but also modern stories, because not only do I think it's important to show that there's a foundation in history and in our legal systems that dates back hundreds of years for what FIJA teaches, which is that
you forget history, you are doomed to repeat it.
You have the right to judge the law as well as the facts in a case. And if you think the law is wrong or the law is wrongly applied in the case at hand, you have the right to vote not guilty, even if you believe it was proved beyond reasonable doubt that someone technically broke that law. So not only is there a foundation for that in hundreds of years of history, but that is also something that is not obsolete. It's something that's still in use today. And I am excited to talk to you about some of those trials. Let's start, though, with the first one. And that is, in fact, this wasn't actually the first one, but it's the first one for us today because we are commemorating this case. And that is the trial of William Penn and William Meade. And this is an interesting case because it was clearly a setup by government. If you go to the FIJA the FIJA website, to our Jury Rights Day page, and I will endeavor to post a link to that here shortly, you will find a link to the transcript of that trial. And by transcript, I think what I mean is, my research indicates that later, sometime after this trial, William Penn and William Meade went and wrote up their recollections of how the trial went, but their recollections seem extremely specific, like it's an exchange of specific dialogue. So there is a possibility they may have embellished a bit. It's possible that they were a little more eloquent in their verbiage than in real life. But it's what we have. It's the best account we have of that trial. So what happened in that trial? Well, as it turns out, William Penn was a Quaker in England at a time when Quakers were heavily looked down on, discriminated against. They were not the approved religion of the state, and laws were in fact passed to prevent them from engaging in their worship as they saw fit, and also presumably to prevent them from enticing other people to join them. In the case of William Penn, he actually had a meeting house, but the government decided they would go and lock it up, knowing full well that this would not prevent him from preaching as he felt called to do. And indeed, Penn did preach that day with his meeting house locked up he instead chose to preach in Grace Church Street in public. Now, this probably violated England's Conventicles Act. There were more than one. It looks like one was updated in anticipation of more anti-Quaker actions. But it looks like he violated that law. What's interesting in the trial transcript, though, is that Penn asks, well, what law did I violate? And the judge doesn't cite that law. The judge, and by the judge, I mean the judge who did most of the talking. There were actually multiple judges in this trial, and I don't have a good handle on why that was.
People, does that sound familiar, that the judges don't answer what law you violated?
But the judge, who was essentially leading the bench, said, oh, you violated the common law. And he wouldn't cite a specific law, and I don't know what the reason for that would be. Nonetheless, it's likely that Penn did violate this Conventicles Act based on the language that I've read. And therefore, he basically was saying to his jurors, look, A, they can't even tell me what law I violated, but B, you should follow your conscience in any case. And he made quite a lot of noise about that during his trial, to the point where not only were judges screaming at him, but he was actually thrown in, I believe it's called the bail dock, which is basically to remove him from the presence of the jurors. And there's this great moment in this trial where, as
I believe we call that contempt of court today. Could be wrong.
He's being dragged away. He's exhorting the jurors, vehemently, mind your privilege, give not away your right. And that is something that has stuck with me to this day. Indeed, those jurors did mind their privilege. What happened to them? Well, they were at one point sent off to deliberate, and when they came back, the judge wanted to know their verdict. Well, he's guilty.
Now remember this on y'all. What makes us a little bit more different than them was that we have no kings. Now kings has subjects, and everybody had privileges. Even though they had our Constitution, they still had a king. Alright? So, where we're at, the United States, we have no kings. So we are not subjects. But we do volunteer into privileges.
Of speaking in Grace Church Street. That was all they would say. And the judge said that's not enough. He was being tried for conspiracy and for a violent tumult, essentially a riot, that he was conspiring with William Meade, his co-defendant, to cause this disturbance in the street. And the jurors simply would not convict him of that. And what ended up happening, I believe it was about 4 days that they ended up being, at 3 or 4 days, they were imprisoned. And in that time, not only did they have food and water withheld them, but tobacco and fire. They couldn't even smoke in prison. And of course, there were no sanitary facilities, so it was just a filthy situation that they were stuck in. The goal of the judge, as he explicitly stated, was, we will have a verdict from you or you will starve for it. He wanted them to hurt until they changed their vote. So what did they do? Well, it looks like about 4 of the jurors.
Okay, let's go into a little bit more detail on this, all right? Now, the true deal about this was the king ordered the judge to put the juries in there to make sure they went by the king's law. Okay, so the judges was threatened from the king, which was really the whole purpose of 700 years of them making basically treaties, okay, constitution, over the 700 years, so the kings could not do this. And that's the reason why we have judges today, really, is because the kings can easily take over the judge and have them waver their way, even with jurors. And in this case, this is what happened. So the king told them, judge, to arrest the jurors so they can come back and, be in the king's favor.
And it's hard to tell exactly from the record, but about 4 of the jurors were like, we're not changing our verdict. When they came back, finally the court accepted a not guilty verdict from them. They wouldn't even continue with the guilty of speaking verdict. They said just not guilty at that point. And so the verdict was accepted, and the jurors were once again thrown in prison because the judge levied a fine on them. He was going to penalize them for voting their conscience with a fine, and they were to stay in jail until they paid it. Well, what ended up happening is that led by jury foreman Edward Bushell or Bushell. I've seen it with 1 L and 2 L's, and I've never really been sure of the pronunciation, so choose your pronunciation, I guess. He appealed that punishment to a higher court, and that higher court, led by a justice named John Vaughan, ended up ruling that jurors could not be punished for their verdict. And that is a key piece of our legal system still today that essentially empowers jurors with their right of jury nullification. Not only can you not be punished for your verdict, but what really gives it teeth is if you deliver a not guilty verdict, it can't be overturned in criminal court. So those two things together.
Yeah, and again, the reason why I bring up every now and then judges became king is because they're not allowed to change it. And yet, they do so. Right? Back in that day, kings were in control. However, in the United States, judges somehow or another found a way to become kings. And if they're not kings, then why do we have qualified immunity? That does not exist.
Are rights that jurors have, and those rights summed up and essentially total up to jury nullification or conscientious acquittal, some people call it. And so that is the story of William Penn and why we celebrate today, September 5th, in honor of that verdict accepted September 5th, 1670. If you are lucky enough to be in London at some point and you travel to the courthouse known as the Old Bailey, there is indeed a plaque hanging up in the Old Bailey to this day explaining how these hero jurors not only saved William Penn, but also established this right of jury nullification still today. Now, something I'm going to mention about this is it's not just our jury rights that are grounded in this case, but if you look at the First Amendment, the 5 freedoms listed there are at least 4 of those 5 that I can trace back to cases of jury nullification, and 3 of them trace back to this case in particular: freedom of religion, freedom of speech, and freedom of assembly all find some foundations in this case. And so it is very important to recognize that not only do we have the Constitution in the United States that guarantees these things, but a lot of these things are also grounded in historical cases such as this one. The 4th of those rights that traces back to a case of jury nullification is freedom of the press. And this also has a wonderful story that predates the founding of the United States, though it does take place on North American soil. In fact, in the colony of New York.
Okay, so we're going to stop it there because I know how long you guys don't like long videos. Be so for the people. Bye, y'all.